Welcome to Unit 3, Learning Objective 3. In the last learning objective, we talked about the social construction of deviance. And in this learning objective, we're going to critically assess 4 sociological theories about the social prompting of deviance. Let's talk about some guiding questions that are going to lead our discussion on this topic. First, we need to talk about what makes a sociological perspective on deviance distinct. Next, we want to talk about the 4 major theorists of deviance and explain their theories of social prompting. Finally, we want to ask what are some strengths and limitations of each of their theories. Let's discuss what makes the sociological perspective on deviance distinctive from other social science perspectives. So, throughout the 1900s, the prevailing views of deviance and crime were mostly not focused on social explanations. They were focused on individual explanations, which include moral and spiritual explanations, medical and psychological explanations, including genetic and racial explanations. So, a moral and spiritual explanation would be something like people commit crimes or acts of deviance because they are wicked. They are a moral failure. They're an evil person. A medical or psychological explanation would be that people commit crimes or acts of deviance because they're either mentally ill or because they're biologically or racially inferior. In other words, people commit crimes because they belong to a criminal type. Criminality and deviant behavior is heritable, meaning if your parents are criminal, then you are more likely to be criminal. This led to a lot of eugenicist arguments. In other words, if someone is a criminal type, meaning not only might they have committed crimes themselves, but perhaps they just belong to one of these criminal types. People who have a specific skull shape, people who have specific facial features, people who have eyes that are too far apart, people who have too square a jaw, people who have too specific facial features, or body habituses, or too much hair on specific parts of their bodies. Shouldn't reproduce because they're more likely to create criminal children. And so this was a major argument in cases of forced sterilization. So you can see how biological and racial arguments about criminality and deviance led directly to eugenicist arguments. Sociological arguments instead attribute deviance and crime primarily to social factors and not individual or internal ones. Sociological perspective would say people who commit crimes are not inherently or internally different from people who don't. They just face different circumstances and are exposed to different situations and different inputs. In other words, if a different person were put in the same situation, they might do something very similar. The first theory we're going to talk about is Robert Merton's structural strain theory, which we often just call strain theory. Merton theorized that deviance often happens when there's a mismatch between socially approved goals and socially approved means of reaching those goals. Merton says that people, whether they commit deviance or not, tend to want the same things within a society. That is, whatever that society's idea of the good life is. So in our society, that might be something like having a nice house, having a job we enjoy, having a family that we love, having enough money to feel comfortable and secure, and to take a vacation every now and then, and to retire someday. And we're told to achieve those goals through institutionalized means, that is, socially approved means. And those means for us might include something like go to school, study hard, be honest, obey the rules, obey the law, obey your parents, get a good job, work hard at your job, and you'll achieve success. And for a lot of people that might work, Merton says. For other people, though, with fewer resources, they might perceive a mismatch between the culturally valued goals and the socially approved means. That they may perceive that those means of achieving the goal wouldn't work for them. And he says, when that happens, they have one of 5 options. They can either conform. They can say, I believe that even though my school is underfunded, that even though my neighborhood has a lot of crime in it, I believe that if I study hard and work my hardest and obey the law and keep my head down, I will achieve the goal. Ritualism would be another response where one would say, I know that because there are no good jobs in my neighborhood and because my classrooms are overcrowded and because poverty in my neighborhood is really high and because my parents can't really afford to send me to a good college even if I get in, I'm unlikely to really achieve my goals through the means that I'm told to use. But those means are the best available. I'm going to go ahead and pursue those means anyway. I'm going to follow the rules, trust the system, and just try my best, even if I know success is unlikely. Innovation is a response in which the person says, I'm going to get those outcomes. I'm going to achieve those goals, even if I have to get pretty creative to get there. I don't think that the system I've been told about, I don't believe the means I've been given are going to work for me. So I'm going to create my own means to get there. I'm going to maybe have to do something besides study hard in school. I'm going to have to do something besides maybe work hard at a job to get enough money to get that nice house. But I'm going to get there. Retreatism would be a response in which a person would say, I don't think those goals are really available at all. And I don't think that those means are good for anything. I reject the goals and I reject the means. And rebellion is a 5th response in which a person would say, I don't like those goals. I don't think those goals are good for me. And I have my own goals instead. I don't want a lot of money. I don't want a pretty house. I don't want a family. I want to live in the woods, off the grid, build a cabin with my own hands, and live off the land and not be bothered by anybody. And I don't need an education and a good job to do that. I need outdoor skills and hunting and trapping and wilderness survival. And those are my new goals and my new means for getting it. So that would be an example of rebellion. Now, bear in mind, rebellion is deviant in the sense that it violates social norms and expectations, not deviant in that it's criminal or hurts anybody. But rebellion could be criminal. If someone said, I'm going to, my goal is not to have a nice house and a good job and a loving family, it's to run a drug syndicate, right? So people can have different new goals and new means. Just because they're deviant doesn't mean that they're criminal or harmful, but it could. A strength of Merton's theory is that it accounts for why people with fewer resources commit certain acts of deviance. But a limitation is that it fails to account for the acts of deviance committed by people with more resources. So for more on that, you can see Sutherland's theory of differential association on page 133. It's not one we're going to discuss in this lecture, but it is really interesting. He also talks about white-collar crime. A good follow-up to Merton's strain theory is William Julius Wilson's theory of social disorganization. So Wilson was writing in a time when there was a discourse about crime in the inner city and crime in urban, predominantly minority neighborhoods. And the discourse was about why those neighborhoods had high rates of crime and deviance, and they were largely defaulting to cultural explanations. In other words, there's something wrong with people of color who live in these neighborhoods that's causing them to commit acts of deviance. And William Julius Wilson, a sociologist writing from the south side of Chicago, said, I think we should consider that possibly it's the neighborhoods rather than the types of people in them. We might want to consider the effects of the neighborhoods themselves. He was building on earlier works on neighborhood effects from the 1920s and 30s. And he said, I think we should go back to looking at neighborhood effects. And so he theorized that deviance is more common in dysfunctional neighborhoods. And he did research to demonstrate that these inner city neighborhoods were characterized by insecure social networks, family instability, and low collective efficacy. And this was caused by few job opportunities, caused by rapid deindustrialization, but also a phenomenon called white flight, where when the neighborhood loses industry, when manufacturing jobs disappear and are kind of moved overseas or moved offshore, or moved to rural areas where it's cheaper to pay workers and where it's cheaper to buy land, that these jobs disappear, anyone who can afford to get out will. And that white residents of these neighborhoods often had more money and knew more people other places and were more likely to leave first. And that this led to a concentration of folks with less wealth and who were less well connected, leading to fewer job opportunities because industry was gone, and so were the people with the money to kind of start up new businesses. Concentrated poverty, which Wilson defined as a situation in which 40% or more of the neighborhood lived below the poverty threshold. Poorly performing schools, because schools are funded by property taxes, absence of local organizations, and political disinvestment and neglect of infrastructure. Because if a population has a low tax base and is perceived to be less likely to organize and less likely to vote and less likely to have political wherewithal, then politicians may not be motivated to pass policy that's favorable to them. A strength of this explanation was that it explained neighborhood differences in deviant behavior in terms of economic opportunity rather than individual or cultural deficits. But a limitation is that Wilson's arguments about neighborhood have been conflated with arguments about groups of people. In other words, Wilson was trying to counter arguments about the types of people who lived in these neighborhoods by saying, it's not who lives here. Anyone who lived in these neighborhoods would be subjected to these same conditions and would have fewer opportunities to make money and survive through legitimate means, and would be put in the position of engaging in deviant activities to survive. His quote was, deviance is a rational response to unmanageable circumstances. But because he was describing the situations of predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods, others were quick to conflate his arguments with arguments about the people who lived in those neighborhoods. Finally, let's drill down and move from the kind of macro to the micro and talk about an interpersonal process, how a social process could affect an individual. So Howard Becker created labeling theory, where he theorizes that people who are labeled as deviants are not especially different from people who are not. In other words, he says almost everyone commits deviant acts at some point or another. It's not about who is deviant and who is not deviant. It's about who gets caught and who gets punished. Because even if two people both get caught, the person who gets formally punished is the person who is the deviant. Here's how he says that works. He says labeling creates deviance through a two-step process. First, there's primary deviance, which occurs when a person is caught doing a deviant behavior and labeled a deviant. For example, when a child is caught taking candy without paying and labeled a shoplifter. Now, of course, a lot of children take candy without paying, or other things. But most of them are not labeled as shoplifters. Most of them, their parents take them back into the store, act all embarrassed, and say, oh my gosh, my kid picked this up without paying while I wasn't paying attention, and I'm so sorry, here it is back, or let me pay for this, I'm really sorry. And the person in charge goes, oh my goodness, no problem, kids do this all the time. But other times, the kid is caught by the salesperson or the manager and is called a shoplifter. Or they're caught by a security officer or loss prevention and called a shoplifter. And that is when the label is applied. That's the process of primary deviance. Secondary deviance is when the person engages in further acts of deviance prompted by the initial label. For example, the child gains a reputation as a shoplifter. So local stores won't sell to them, or their parents take their allowance, and then the only way to get candy is to steal it. If a child gets a reputation as a shoplifter, local stores might not want them to go in. There might even be a sign with their little face on it in the shop that says, don't sell to this kid, or this kid's not welcome. And then other local stores might get the idea. And then that kid may be made to feel unwelcome. Or the kid's parents may punish them or stop taking them to the stores. And so then sneaking things may be how they can get things. So that would be secondary deviance, where the child is kind of compelled to live into the label. Another way that could work is the child then feels that, well, everyone treats me like a criminal anyway, I might as well. Every time I go in a store, someone thinks I'm shoplifting. Why not? So a strength of this theory is that it highlights the far-reaching consequences of deviant labels. A limitation is the causal relationship between primary and secondary deviance may be unclear, and that it fails to account for agency. In other words, is it really that the child continues to shoplift because they were labeled? Or is it just that a person who shoplifts once might do it again? That causal relationship isn't solid. It can be hypothesized, but it's very difficult to test. And it fails to account for agency. A child might just as well say, oh my goodness, being called a shoplifter is terrible. Let me never do that again. In conclusion, the takeaways from this lecture are that sociologists attribute deviance to social causes rather than individual causes. Strain theory, social disorganization theory, and labeling theory each describe systematic observations about the social prompting of deviance. That is, how social factors promote deviance or lead to deviance. And each theory has specific strengths and limitations, which point to the importance of multiple theories as well as directions for future research.